This is Dr. Koenig, and this is Counseling Research, Chapter 10, Grounded Theory Designs. So grounded theory is a qualitative method. It requires the understanding of some of the philosophical underpinnings of the method. In grounded theory research, the observer does influence the object of the study. The context changes from the beginning to the end and between replications. It does lend itself really well to human interactions because most things that are coming from a qualitative perspective do that. It is sensitive to cultural considerations. There are several different types of qualitative research. We have ethnography, narrative analysis, storytelling, shadowing, but the approach that really comes the closest to sort of the philosophical underpinnings of counseling is grounded theory. So in grounded theory, we take a systematic qualitative method. It emphasizes the generation of theory from data while we're conducting research. Okay, so the importance of theory in research. Theory provides a basis for our action. Hopefully, it accounts for consistency and or variation within a particular phenomenon, and it should be able to explain and it should be able to predict. So the abstraction of a theory hopefully allows us a broadening of its applicability within different contexts. So hopefully we can, if we have a theory, apply that to things that are sort of abstractly adjacent to the theory that we are focusing on. All right, so to get started with grounded theory research, we have to have some interest in a topic. We can have interest in just about anything. What occurs on a day-to-day basis, if you are a counselor, might be something that you decide that you want to research, and that's usually how most research gets started. We see a question or we have a curiosity about something. So we have a personal interest in something that might be an area for research. And if there's not really something that piques our interest or crosses our path day to day, and we want to do some research, we might hit the literature and start reading what's out there, and then that might actually give us some ideas. All right, so once we've got our idea and we've got our plan, we know what we're going to do. We've decided on grounded theory research, which we're in this chapter, so that's what we're going to be deciding on as of like right now. So what we need to do is we need to select our participants and gather our data. So we look at participant interviews because they give us really, really rich data. And we want to understand that whenever we're doing grounded theory research, whenever we're doing any kind of qualitative research, really, reality is viewed as being a constructed phenomenon. And this is another term for this is symbolic interactionalism. So symbolic interactionalism assumes that people are dynamic, that they're resourceful, they construct themselves, their roles, and they actually construct through society through interacting with each other. Reality is viewed as emerging through interaction. So if I interact with someone and that person seems to me to be like they don't like me, then my reality is changed by that interaction. If I interact with someone and that person seems to like really take a liking to me, then my reality is going to be changed by that interaction. So this process provides insights into how participants make sense of their experiences. It also participants are also enriched by hearing themselves describe their experiences, and you can sort of see where that has a lot of overlap with what it is that we do in counseling. Okay, so once we have our interview's done and we've recorded our data. And normally what happens is we're going to do our interviews, we're going to tape that, we're going to send it off to somebody who's actually going to write out all of the questions and all of the answers, and we're going to pay them something to do that because it's a heck of a lot of work. So there are actually folks who do that for a living, I guess. So let's say we've done our interview, we've sent our tapes off, we've had somebody go through and put those in written format for us, type them up, and they come back to us. So what now we need to do is we need to code our data. So coding is just really making sense of the data. We're trying to boil it down to figure out what the data is telling us and to be able to describe that. So we label fragments of the data in such a way that each piece of data is categorized and summarized. And that can be, it can be a phrase, it can be just a couple of words, whatever we think is going to represent that data the best, or that category of data. So breaking down the data helps us see the nuances of the data and relationships between the data or among the data. So concepts, this is just some terminology. Concepts are ideas that emerge from the phenomenon that we're studying when it's in its raw form, before it's analyzed. We can begin to look through the data and maybe concepts will jump out at us. So if there's several themes that are embedded in the respondent's language, then that would be something that we want to look at as a concept or as maybe a category, or break it into different categories. Okay, and categories are general groups of data. They're related to concepts and they help identify the themes that emerge. So we're basically slicing the pie into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. So the categories then get divided into properties and dimensions. And this helps further describe what that category of data contains. So a property is a characteristic that gives substance or richness or meaning. It expands the contextual understanding of a category and helps flesh out the concepts. And then a dimension is the range along which the property of a category varies. So in quantitative analysis, this would be our range. That's more or less equal to dimension in grounded theory research. And I borrowed this. You can see down here our reference from it. I borrowed this because I thought it was a decent illustration where someone has done a grounded theory study, and it has a really good diagram here of what this process was like. So you can sort of look through this, and it's using grounded theory in a particular way. Okay, so coding continued. Coding, there's a really good example of I think it's line by line coding that's in your book on page 200. So you can look at that and get an idea of what this would look like. Open coding, there's open coding, which basically is just word by word, or line by line. The next one down here. So we're going to name each line of the dialogue or the data. You see that in your book. And then there's focus coding. And focus coding really just focuses on developing categories by group. All right. So as we are looking at the data and trying to code the data, there are some other things that we can be involved in doing. And that is starting with field notes, going through memoing, and then possibly diagramming, And some of these things happen at the same time. Field notes and diagramming, or diagramming and memoing, can all happen at the same time. All right, so while we are coding the data, we want to be putting field notes in about our impressions, our insight, whatever it is that we think we're seeing in the data, any connections. If we have follow-up questions, we want to write that in a field note. So field notes are just descriptions of what occurs during the data gathering, our initial impression about what is emerging from the data, and sort of this conversation with ourselves that we're having as we are beginning to look at the data. Memoing, we move to when we're actually begin the coding process. So it is a product of analysis, and it helps the researcher analyze the analytical and conceptual versus the descriptive. All right, and then diagramming. Diagramming is just a concept map. It should help us develop and delineate whatever the process is. If we had a really good diagram, we can capture an entire process at a glance. And that's sort of what this fella did when he was done with his research. He put this diagram in, and it really helps us understand everything from the beginning completely to the end. Let's see. All right. I don't think there's anything else with that. So let's go to the next one. And this is another example just of a diagram. And in this, someone was looking at the phases of focus group research for counseling style development. And it shows here that we have 3 focus groups. We had 3 data sets, and then sort of where saturation, or an example of that shows that saturation. All right. Clustering. Clustering is when we write down an idea, and then we branch out associations from that idea as a way of brainstorming and maybe connecting categories. Free writing is really close to free association in therapy. You write in short bursts of time, no constraints, no conventional form. Don't worry about spelling, don't worry about format, you just write. All right, so theoretical sampling, saturation, and sorting. So theoretical sampling puts attention on whether or not a sample is representative of less than optimally developed categories. So all theories have some part that's weaker than others. So if we're doing theoretical sampling, we're going to take some of the theories that may be sort of on the edge of the theory that we're thinking might develop, and we're going to look at, we're going to try to pull data that helps us develop those underdeveloped portions, or come up with a new theory that also sort of intersects and those things that are already in existence, and then explains them. Okay, so when a category becomes saturated, basically if we have so much data that any new data fails to really add anything to our knowledge or give us any additional insight, then we call that saturated. So once we've reached that point, we can stop collecting data. Okay, sorting. Sorting is just a method that we use to organize our analytical notes, our memos, our diagrams, so that they're in a logical sequence that really stimulates the developing theory and the organization of the written results of the study. All right, so once we have our coding done, once we have began to look at our theory and our theory sampling, we might begin to diagram something out. And as we look at our diagram, what we're really doing, hopefully, is we're constructing a theory that explains whatever it is the phenomenon is that we're looking at. We can write the results of that research, and we want to ensure trustworthiness of our findings. And we've got a slide on that, I think the next slide. So if we're developing theory, it should be a very deliberate process that is developed through the analytic work, and it should be constructed through our memos and our diagrams, which I think I've already said that in another way. All right, so as far as trustworthiness of our findings whenever it comes to grounded theory research, these are some of the strategies, and you'll see here, it's not one or two, there are 12 different things. I'll let you look in your book to sort of see how each one of these is defined. There's not anything on here, I don't think that we really, that is anything difficult. It's pretty self-explanatory, really, because I think everything on here we either had, or it's not anything that's, really, really difficult. Okay. So here is another example of a diagram. And this is just a diagram that is on the validating a theory of counselor development. And you can sort of see at the end of this grounded theory research, this is the theory that they diagrammed out. All right, travel. What is travel? Well, in grounded theory, travel occurs when a concept in the emerging theory can be used to expand existing theories in other contexts. And that's what I was trying to explain a while ago when I was talking about sort of interaction. I wasn't doing it very well, but that's what travel is. Okay, so for example, emotional stress of homeschooling on mothers. This stress is related to identity of white middle-class women, and there's theory around that. So we have sort of the interaction of two things going on. In other words, the travel is represented there. And that ends chapter 10.